All right, welcome everyone. We'll give everyone another couple seconds to join us. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on the Giving Report launch day, our official public launch day. My name is Nicole Denisi. I am the Senior Manager of Strategic Communications and Brand at CanadaHelps, and I'm very pleased to be here today with Julie Fiorini. She is our General Manager of Donor Services and Brand at CanadaHelps, and Mitchell Hillier, who is the Director of Business Development, Not-for-Profit, and Education Lead. So they are your two wonderful speakers for today. I'm here just to provide the introduction and welcome you all. Before we get into the content and material, before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that today we are grateful to be meeting on the unceded territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. That is where I am currently located, and we welcome you to add where you are located to acknowledge the land within the chat. As you will hear more about later today, Indigenous charities are still one of the most underfunded groups of charities in Canada, and it's important for us to not only acknowledge the land we are currently gathered on, but for each and every settler to recognize Indigenous ingenuity, brilliance, and abundance, and engage in reconciliation by supporting Indigenous-led charities. So one of the things I wanted to mention off the top is that you'll see that CanadaHelps has gone through a really exciting rebrand. You'll see a new logo and new colors and a new look and feel for CanadaHelps. And we're really excited to be celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. So this rebrand was tied to this exciting milestone for our organization. And the last thing I'll mention before handing it off to Julie is that we can't hear you on the call. We are very pleased to have you here and we want you engaged. We welcome you to be asking questions in the Q&A chat. So please make sure that you are popping in any questions throughout the presentation and that Mitch and Julie will leave some time at the end in order to answer any of your areas of curiosity. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Julie, and Cindy, my colleague, is in the back end also. If you have any questions, please message Cindy in the chat, and Cindy will be managing our Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. And welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the session on the Giving Report and really investing your time in education and deepening your learning. As Nicole mentioned, my name is Julie Fiorini. I'm the General Manager of Donor Services and Brand at CanadaHelps. And as most of you probably know, CanadaHelps produces the Giving Report every year in partnership with Imagine Canada and Environics Analytics, and we just want to thank them for their continued support. Without them, we wouldn't be able to produce it at this level, so we're incredibly grateful. And as of today, the Giving Report is alive and available for downloading on CanadaHelps, and I'll share the link a little bit later. And yes, as Nicole mentioned, we've launched a new brand for CanadaHelps. So would love to hear if anyone has thoughts on that, share them in the chat or let us know offline, but would love to hear your feedback. So before we dive into the results, just to give you a bit of context, for the report, we actually use multiple data sources, including our own transactional data at CanadaHelps, processing close to $500 million a year in donations every year. So we've got a gold mine of data. We also take advantage of the Canada Revenue Agency or CRA tax filer data, which is available publicly. Unfortunately, it's always a couple of years behind. So what we'll reference today is from 2023, just so you're aware. And then, of course, Environics Analytics supplements this with their really interesting overlay data, which includes a robust consumer segmentation system, which Mitch will share with you a bit later on. And what we decided to do for this year's Giving Report is actually look at the period between 2018 to 2024, specifically because we wanted to see the trends before and after the pandemic to understand how that impacted or how that has been impacting charitable giving. And so we're really thankful that you're joining us today. And on behalf of Canada Helps, like we produce this report really to support thousands of charities like those of you are representing on this call to ensure that you have the knowledge and can make some informed decisions around fundraising programs. So let me go on to the next slide. I hope, Mitch, if you can give me a thumbs up that you see a goalie and a gymnast on this one. Yeah, perfect, excellent. Okay, so before we dig in, we're going to use this analogy here. So, and you know, I'm sorry, I had to include a photo of the goalie from the Florida Panthers. Yes, I get it. We wanted Edmonton to win, but didn't happen. So we've got the Panthers goalie here next to an elite gymnast. And I just want to ask, like, think about it, put it in the chat or just ponder it. What do you feel is the difference between an elite hockey goalie and a gymnast? And, you know, feel free to add that to the chat or just, you know, think about it. So as you're thinking about it, I'm sure we can all agree, they're both tough, you know, really at the top of their game from a physical point of view. They both train, they're both incredibly flexible. But fundamentally, the difference is when a gymnast performs, it's all about precision and repetition of a specific routine. And there's very little wiggle room if, you know, they want to improvise. That's kind of hard when you're doing a routine, especially to music, as some of these are. And then versus the goalie, you have to be prepared for anything and everything that comes at you and respond quickly. Of course, it still requires athletic skills like flexibility and endurance, but it's a whole other performance. And when we look at this analogy and apply it to the giving report, what we found is that while, you know, the trends that we've been watching for years continue, external events are really disrupting donor behavior and traditional fundraising cycles. And so this disruption is really the new norm in the charitable sector. And so we need to be ready. We need to be ready just like a hockey goalie. And so that's how we wanted to start off this discussion. Yeah, so for the next 15 minutes or hopefully less, I'm going to go through 12 of the top findings from the giving report, and then Mitch will talk to you about how it relates to Environics Analytics data. So let's dive in. So just a refresher on Canada Helps. We've been around since 2000. We actually just celebrated our 25th anniversary. Hence, you know, the refocusing on a new revitalized brand. We had a launch event last night, which some folks hopefully on the call were able to attend in Toronto. Mitch was there. And we're really shifting Canada Helps positioning from purely a giving platform to being rooted in generosity and really being the epicenter for generosity in Canada. And you'll be hearing a lot more about that as time goes on. So we, as I mentioned, we process close to $500 million a year in donations for all charities. We support all charities in Canada. And since 2000, we've actually surpassed 3.6 billion raised over this 25-year history. So we, you know, we are incredibly grateful for the partnership with charities like yourselves on this call. So let me go to the first highlight of this year's giving report, and this won't come as a surprise, I'm sure, to anyone. So when we looked at 2023 CRA tax filer data, which shows the amount of tax receipts that Canadians who are actually filing income tax returns have claimed, that number grew by more than $1 billion from the previous year. So we are now at, as of 2023, $12.8 billion in tax receipts claimed for charitable donations. And that is the largest year-over-year increase ever recorded since the CRA has been making tax filer data publicly available. So that is That is great. That is a great stat to share. However, you couple that with the fact that although the absolute figure of donations is going up, fewer people are giving, and that takes us to the next slide. So the trend that we've been watching for years, and we've certainly highlighted this in past giving reports, is that the percentage of people claiming these tax receipts is going down. And in 2023, as you can see at the right-hand side of the slide, we are now below 17%. So it's 16.8% as of 2023. And in 2005, you can see it was at 25%. So it's been steadily declining. Now, I just want to again highlight that CRA tax filer data is not the only way to measure charitable giving in Canada. However, it's been the most reliable way. And you know, it's difficult to get other sources of data. So for now, we're sort of using that as our measuring stick, but at CanadaHelps, we're actively trying to, you know, figure out how to get other sources, including our own, to build a more robust picture. Before I move on, and maybe if people are willing in the chat, wondering if you're also seeing this at your organization, if you are either working or volunteering at a charity, if you are seeing, you know, the number of donors in your donor base declining while revenues either plateau or increase. So in other words, average gift is going up, but the number of donors is going down. So I'm just going to take a peek here and see if there is anything. And my colleague Cindy, she can fill me in if anything comes up of interest, but we will move on. So the other interesting piece here, again, not a surprise, is that top earning taxpayers actually account for the biggest increases in giving. So the rise in total donations, so that $12.8 billion number, is being driven by larger average gifts from a smaller group of donors. And that group actually consists of higher net income donors. And so what we saw was when we looked at 2022 to 2023, taxpayers that are earning more than $1 million in personal income, which represents only about 0.1% of Canadians, by the way, they accounted for almost 60% of the overall increase in giving dollars. So this very small group is accounting for about 21% of total donations in 2023. So that, you know, a bit concerning given, you know, the shrinking donor pool. So then on the other hand, when we look at donors who have lower household incomes or single personal incomes under 60,000 or under, the number of donors actually claiming tax receipts on their returns dropped by about 6% in 2023. And at the same time, the total amount donated by this group of lower income earners similarly dropped by about 6%. So this is totally attributable to just declining giving and not declining numbers of people that are in this income threshold, because that income threshold actually continues to go up. But what's happening is their ability to actually, you know, make donations, claim receipts on their income tax returns, just not happening, because there's trade-offs that obviously need to happen with, especially with things like cost of living increases, inflation, interest rates going up, housing affordability crises, all of that. So that all factors in. So the other thing we saw demographically in 2023 is that Canadians aged 65 plus are also the ones who are driving most of the giving in Canada. Nearly 1 in 4, so about a quarter of those that are giving are the ones that are 65 and over. And that group actually makes up about 35% of all donors. and attributed to nearly half of donated dollars. So no question, it's an aging donor base. We certainly are seeing that on the CanadaHelps end as well. Although we don't specifically ask donors for their age when they're making a donation on our platform, when we've done donor surveys and they've voluntarily shared that information with us, we are seeing the same thing, that the 65 plus crowd definitely represents the majority of folks who are giving through the CanadaHelps platform. So this very much aligns with what we're seeing. Okay, and this piece was interesting too, which came from our colleagues at Imagine Canada. And what they highlighted was that 2/3 of the increase in giving between close to a 10-year period from 2013 to 2022 went just to 150 charities, which is less than 0.2% of all receiving charities in Canada. And this group of 150 charities is made up of large organizations, predominantly hospital foundations, universities, grant-making organizations, many of which are really built to have, you know, a high net worth donor, and they appeal to them with things like major gifts, calls to action, or planned giving, that type of thing. And so on the other front, smaller charities, small to mid-sized charities, they saw flat or declining donation levels. And so this was another concerning stat. So I'm going to just blank screen here because we want to go to some more positive information here. We don't want to just share with you some of the negative stuff, which I'm sure a lot of you are quite familiar with, especially the fundraisers on the call. So when we actually look at CanadaHelps data beyond 2023, because we can look at more recent data, we actually had a very strong 2024. And let me just share with you some of those stats. So while average total giving per donor through CanadaHelps grew by 10% in 2024, total giving increased by 7%. So the average gift outpaced the total number of donations. So in 2024, we actually received 482 million in donations to charities across Canada through CanadaHelps, and that was up from 450 million from 2023. And so you may be wondering what accounted for that 10% growth. And very much it points to the postage strike in late 2024, where many charities and many donors, you know, rightfully pivoted to digital fundraising and were able to rebound from what could have potentially been, you know, very you know, underwhelming fundraising period in late 2024. And so that disruption of that postal strike, as we saw even during COVID and the, you know, that time frame, a national disruption has driven more giving online. And I can also tell you, as we're almost through the first half of 2025, incredibly to say that already, data from 2025 also shows growth in both donor numbers as well as average gift size. And so what we have seen is a 24% increase in total donations on the CanadaHelps platform this year. And again, if we attribute it to the postage strike and the resulting decision by the federal government to extend the charitable taxation deadline to February 28th, that was certainly a factor. That, I mean, January and February historically is not exactly, you know, a strong period. It was absolutely the case this year in 2025. So again, would love to hear if anybody has seen the same thing. So all this to say, unexpected events like the postage strike, like the pandemic, it definitely is destabilizing traditional sources and fundraising cycles. And so when something like this postage strike comes up right before the busy holiday season and throws a wrench into charities' plans, that's where that goalie mindset comes in, where there is a disruption. We weren't exactly prepared. Yes, we heard it was going to maybe happen, and then it did happen. The charities that were ready digitally were able to move, to use the hockey analogy again, move to where the puck was going and really, pivot to digital fundraising. And we actually did some analysis around potential dollars lost during the 2024 holiday giving season. And we estimate close to 300 million in losses across the sector from things, specifically like direct mail, where that would have been, a huge source of revenue for many charities, and just did not happen. So another example from the report that I wanted to share is that so external events don't just disrupt how people give, but actually where they give. And so when we looked at our data between 2018 and 2024, we found that donations to Indigenous focused charities made through CanadaHelps grew by an incredible 416%, faster than any cause area. And this surge was definitely as a result of, as I'm sure you all can recall, the announcement of the discovery of the probable unmarked graves at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, and how that really marked a turning point in all of our awareness of the devastating legacy of residential schools. And so because of that, when we heard about that in 2021, donations to Indigenous focused charities accounted for about 1.5% of all giving through CanadaHelps. That may not seem like a big number, and it's certainly not as compared to other cause areas, which I'll get into in a moment. But it was certainly an increase, as I said, more than 400% faster than any other cause area on CanadaHelps. And so this chart just illustrates the dramatic rise in support for Indigenous causes between 2018 and 2024. But overall, ultimately, donations for Indigenous focused charities are still quite low, under 1%. And so I just wanted to leave you here with just a message around like what is possible and why it's so important to be able to respond to unexpected events and then to sustain donors that are gained in those, unexpected moments. So to shift to some other trends and other cause areas, what we also found was that environmental causes have definitely gained momentum since 2018, with a growth of about 255%. And in 2024 alone, we saw a sharp increase of about 24%, with environment posting the largest year-over-year growth. So that was very promising. However, again, environmental causes on CanadaHelps only make up about 1% of total donations. So what we shared in last year's giving report is that this might be a factor of people not exactly putting their money where their mouth is. Climate change seems to be a real issue with a lot of us, particularly with the millennial generation. However, that's not necessarily translating into donations. And so although there was some growth in the environmental cause area, still a small percentage on CanadaHelps. The other thing was educational charities have more than doubled between 2018 and 2024. And so education as a cause area remains very popular, always in the top 3 during this period. Religious causes, that stands out for a different reason. And that's the only major cause area to see a year-over-year decline. And in 2024, that decline was about 10%. And since 2018, about 55%. And so I think, as we also shared in last year's giving report, religiosity may have, something to do with declining charitable giving. And you know, we're seeing that in the raw numbers here. And then there's some other causes, including public benefit, animal charities, social services, that have seen relatively stagnant growth since 2021, pretty well leveling off on CanadaHelps after the pandemic era. So one of the most striking shifts that we saw during the pandemic, and which has continued, has been the rise of giving for local or regional causes. And donations increased from 34 million in 2018 to nearly 107 million in 2024, which is about a 216% gain. And so much so that local and regional charities have actually overtaken health as the top cause area by dollar value on CanadaHelps. So in 2020 alone, we actually saw that donations to local and regional causes grew twice as fast as compared to all other categories. And many donors turned to support local groups online in a way that they had never previously embraced. And we're clearly seeing a lot of that now with this Canada First, Canada Strong sentiment that's been going around. You know, a lot of philanthropically minded folks out there want to support Canadian organizations, and that extends to Canadian charities, which is, you know, a great thing for us. So for those of you in the virtual room with a local or regional focus, this is great news, and you know, we encourage you to really embrace that and make the most of it. Okay, so that is it for my piece for now, and I'm going to turn it over to Mitch now to take you through the Environics Analytics piece of this report.
Amazing. Thank you, Julie. And thank you, Nicole, as well as for the introduction earlier on. As they both said, I'm Mitchell Hillier, Director of Business Development and Nonprofit Lead here at Environics Analytics. And I'll just start on the next slide by just briefly speaking to who we are here at Environics Analytics for those who may not be as aware. You know, we were founded in 2003, so almost as long as CanadaHelps, 22 years. But we really try to focus on making our clients more successful through transformative data, insights, and analytics. You know, we're the premier marketing and analytics services company in Canada. We have over 250 employees currently, work across all industries. But what we do really in the nonprofit space is really to help identify or help our clients understand who their donors are through our donor profiling, ranking, segmentation work, which I'll talk a little bit about today as well. You know, wealth screening, multi-channel media planning and execution, and looking at trade areas and different catchment areas as well. You know, we've been a really proud partner of the CanadaHelps Giving Report since 2020. And since then we've had the privilege really to look at their individual donor data, as it's a great representation of Canadian donors. And what we tried to do this year, as Julie mentioned, was, you know, really analyze their data year over year, looking at overall donations, cause types, giving trends, monthly donors, and Giving Tuesday, just to name a few. And it's been fascinating, and as Julie shared, just some of the trends we've been seeing over time. You know, from those influx of donors over the first couple of years of COVID, really supporting hospital foundations and healthcare, to the switch to local and regional giving, and also the increase recently we've been seeing in sort of environmental and giving giving to Indigenous peoples. You know, through this analysis, what we also want to do is try to bring some of these donors to life. You know, help you understand who they are, what sort of giving behaviors do they have, what are their demographics, where are they found in Canada. And all this really stems from our PRISM lifestyle segmentation, which I'll speak a little bit about in the next slide. So for those of you who don't know, PRISM, as I mentioned, is our lifestyle segmentation system. What it does is essentially classifies every single residential postal code in Canada into one of these 67 different lifestyle types you see here. Now, if you're curious, there's a QR code there. You can scan it, enter your postal code. It'll tell you what your PRISM segment is and give you some descriptions of your neighborhood. But what we really did with this is took CanadaHelps individual donor data, ran it through PRISM to identify the segments that were popping up for Canadian donors, added in our own demographic, psychographic, behavioral, and giving behavior and preference data to kind of give a sense and build personas for Canadian donors. And we ended up with 8, as I'll show in sort of the next slide. And these really capture all of Canadian donors into one of 8 different sort of lifestyle types. And as you can see here, we just have some stats, but these are the 8 here. And if we're looking at CanadaHelps donors, the 3 largest ones tend to be wealthy families. And as Julie mentioned, really we're seeing that a large proportion of donors, not just in CanadaHelps, but Canada in general, is from those wealthier neighborhoods, but still a significant proportion from suburban and rural families, but also those younger downtown donors. And those have the highest percentage of donors from CanadaHelps right now. But if we're looking at overall total population and presence within Canada, 3 of the largest groups in the country are still suburban and rural families, but also that urban mixed group, and also our francophone sort of persona right there as well. So, 8 is a lot to go through in this webinar, so I'm going to focus just on 3, as you'll see in the next slide. And we're going to just dive a little bit deeper into these three personas, talking a bit about their demographics, where they're found, their preferences. Again, just to bring to life a little bit about these trends you've been hearing about and who these donors are. So let's just start with wealthy families. And we've included just a brief sort of image here to give you a sense of who they are. But this group really tends to be, these are your middle-aged to older sort of donors. They're 50 plus, they're married, they may have teen or even adult children living at home. Their average income is around $203,000, which might seem a little lower for wealthy families, but keep in mind that this is also still representing about 10% of Canadians or so. There's one of the segments in this particular persona that is the wealthiest in Canada, and their average household income is over $400,000. But to give you a comparison, the average household income in Canada is around $122,000. Okay, so this group is still significantly above that. In terms of diversity, we're seeing average rates for this particular group, but this does tend to be a bit more of an urban group. So they may not be in the downtown core like we're seeing for one of the groups later, but they're still in major cities like Ottawa, Calgary, Toronto, Edmonton. And what we try to pull out as well is what's important to these groups. So if we're looking at their values, legacy and duty are 2 of the ones that pop up super high for this group. These are families that really want to leave something behind, either for their children, for the community, for society, or even for the organizations that they are supporting and looking at some of the reasons for giving, for example. It could be religious obligations, but a lot of it may just be personal association, something that themselves or their family or a friend is actually going through, and that might be why they're supporting the organizations they're donating to. So as Julie mentioned, the 3 sort of giving causes that are the highest really across all of these groups in Canada in general are health and education, as well as local regional. But what we've tried to do in this bucket also is try to showcase what differentiates these groups from the rest of Canada. Are they more likely to donate to these causes? And yes, health and education for this group is still the largest in terms of the revenue for who they're donating to. But if we compare it to the rest of Canada, they're also more likely to donate to those organizations. So, overall, as we're seeing, and as Julie mentioned, we're seeing a bit of a decrease in the donor pool, about 2.8% for this particular persona, but still a 10.5% increase in donor revenue, which is a pretty large jump. And if there are 21% of all donations, and if we were looking at the revenue for CanadaHelps, they represent almost 30% of all donations, just this one persona out of the 8 we've shown. So the next slide, we'll see a little bit of a difference. So shifting from wealthy families that tend to be a bit older and more urban, shifting more down to a bit more of a suburban and rural families, these groups tend to be younger. So the parents may be between 35 and 50 years of age, but they may have preteen or teenage children at home. Their income is $152,000, so lower than the previous group, but still above average compared to Canada. But what's really important to this group is national pride. This is something that's been mentioned even in this presentation and in the giving report, is that idea of Canadians giving to Canadian organizations and having that national pride. So any sort of materials or imagery or messaging that speaks to supporting Canadians is going to go a long way with this group. They may also be a bit concerned about their financial future. They're keeping their finances a bit tight. And you may say, oh, that may not be great for donations, but that's not necessarily what it means. It just means that this group doesn't necessarily need recognition and status for contributing, They more just want to make sure that their dollars are going where they want to go and actually having an impact. Okay, but if we're looking at what the diversity levels tend to be lower compared to some of the other groups we're going to be seeing, but as the name suggests, they are going to be found on the outskirts of major cities or even in rural areas. So looking at places like Halifax, like Ottawa, again popping up for this group, Hamilton, even places like Maple Ridge and Langley, BC, for example. But what was interesting as well is, why is this group giving? We see personally affected popping up again, but also cause. Maybe it's just they're more likely to give to certain causes. And as we can see here with this particular group, if we look at some of their giving causes, it tends to be a bit more focused on some of the different ones that we haven't seen. So social services, public benefit, animal charities, which doesn't always pop up super high. And this is one of the groups that is less likely to give to environmental organizations and Indigenous peoples. But if we're looking overall at, some of their donor characteristics as we analyze, again, about a 2.6% decrease or increasing the revenue. And this is the second largest group in terms of donations and donors. So if we move on to our final sort of picture on who these donors are, we're now focusing on our downtown donors. This is our younger group. And again, by the image here, you get a bit of a sense of who they are. They're located in areas like in the downtown core of Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Calgary, and even really popped up high in Ottawa again. But they're going to events, they're going to restaurants, they're going to concerts. They're really active individuals that tend to be between 25 and 45 years of age. They may be just finishing up university or college, maybe partway through their career. They're singles and couples, may have young children at home. Their income is $137,000 on average. Still not as high as the other two groups, but still above average compared to the rest of Canada. And if we look at what's important to them, we just talked about with the suburban and rural families, the importance of national pride. And yes, this group is still likely proud to be Canadian, but they tend to think on a bit more of a global scale, have that global consciousness. So, how are your organizations impacting on a global level, or how does it relate with some other organizations across the world? That sort of global view, something that might be important to this group. But also, which is not uncommon for some of these younger segments that we've seen, is that value of rejection of authority. They don't necessarily want to hear from CEOs, board members. They want to hear real stories from real people, from volunteers, from peers. They want to see themselves in those stories. That's going to be something that's really important to this particular group. And if we're looking at why they're this is a group that has high diversity. And if we look at why they're giving, it tends to be, can be localized, can be related to their community. Cause, again, is another one that pops up. So we see here that some of the top giving causes and what distinguishes this group from the other PRISM segments that we saw, are arts and culture, Indigenous peoples, environment. Now, these aren't going to be the highest in terms of revenue. Again, that's going to be healthcare or health, education, local and regional. But this group tends to donate to these three causes that we see: arts and culture, and Indigenous peoples, environment, at higher rates than what we see for the rest of Canada. Speaking of, however, it's still, environment only represents about just under 3% of their total contributions, and donation to Indigenous organizations is just over 1% at 1.3. So there's still, it's still a small percentage, even though that growth has been quite large, as Julie mentioned. And what we're really trying to just show here is that, it's great to understand the overall trends within Canada, but it's also important to understand that there are, different populations, different groups within Canada that have different preferences, different giving behaviors, and understanding those differences and who may be more likely to engage with your organizations is a really important part of understanding the changing landscape within Canada as well. So that's all I have on my end. I hope that gave everyone a little bit to think about. Obviously, there'll be some time for questions in the end, but I think I'll pass it over to Julie for the rest of it.
Great. Thank you so much, Mitch. And Cindy, I just want to shout you out too, because I didn't realize chat wouldn't be working for this webinar. So hopefully if there is any comments, it came in through the Q&A. So what we wanted to leave you with before we go into that Q&A portion is that trends from the giving report this year tells us that we're really at an important moment in time that calls not for the repetition or routine of the gymnast that we talked about at the beginning, but readiness, like that hockey goalie. And in this world of fast-moving news cycles, you know, we keep hearing about the potential for a recession this year in Canada, how US protectionist measures may be impacting our economy and jobs, and, you know, a shrinking pool of these top high net worth donors. We really need to be able to tap into these disruptive events like a postage strike, like a pandemic, a recession, if and when they happen. And we can't be gymnasts repeating the same thing over and over again. Like, we really have to be ready for anything that's thrown at us as, you know, people that are in the charitable sector. And we're so grateful that you've attended this session today. Download the report. And we just want to give you a few four takeaways before we leave you and go to the Q&A. So the first thing again is just, you know, as this slide says, digital resilience is not an option. So as mentioned with the postage strike and the ability to pivot to online fundraising, charities with that infrastructure were best positioned to absorb that shift, that disruption. So, you know, expect more of that and prepare accordingly is the message here. And then when it comes to growing the donor base, there's 3 different ways that we wanted to share with you that we're observing at CanadaHelps that you might be able to apply at your organizations. And the first thing is securities donations. In other words, gifts of stocks or mutual funds, that type of thing. Again, typically from high net worth donors. So what we are seeing in 2024, donations of securities on CanadaHelps were close to 58 million, and that was up like 5 times from 2018. So again, it's an area that is growing significantly. And this year, the trend continues. I can tell you, even though the markets worldwide have been exceptionally volatile, those donors that have, you know, donations of stock that they want to give to charities, whether it's to reduce their taxable income or, you know, do it for altruistic reasons, whatever the case may be, we are seeing an increase this year as well, and that continues. So definitely think about that, how you can accept donations of securities. And if that's something you can't do, talk to us at CanadaHelps because we can help you with that. The other big growth area that we've observed from 2018 to 2024 is monthly giving. That in 2024 alone has reached over 86 million. So it's roughly a 10% increase from the year before. And again, it continues to grow in 2025. Donors that recognize the value of supporting a charity or a cause with their recurring donation, if they're seeing the impact that they can make, they will support a charity on a monthly level. So think about how you can position your monthly offer to your donor base. And the last one is Giving Tuesday. So CanadaHelps was a co-founder of Giving Tuesday in Canada. And last year was our biggest Giving Tuesday yet, having raised over 16 million on our platform on one day. And that was a close to 20% increase from the year before. So between 2018 and 2024, again, it's grown like 5 times as much as it started. So we encourage you to have a Giving Tuesday strategy. And again, we have resources available to our charity partners should you need that help. So leaving you with Mitch and I's contact information, we are here for you. We are your partners. So if you need anything, feel free to reach out to us. put your questions in the Q&A. And if you haven't already, please do. Here's the QR code. Please do download the giving report and let us know what you think. And yeah, I think we have time for questions. I will leave this QR code up for a moment. But Cindy, if you wanted to just share if any questions have come in, that would be great.
Thank you, Julie and Mitchell, for the great presentation. And thank you everyone for participating and being engaged in the Q&A. Just going back to the beginning, Julie, when you're asking people to share their own experiences, some people said that their donors are going up, but their average gift is going slightly down. So they were seeing the converse of what the data showed.
Okay,
but other
that's
people,
interesting.
Yeah. Other people resonated because of what they see in the wider environment and economy with the shrinking middle class and record high inflation. So it kind of made sense to them.
Great.
Moving into the questions, the donations, are we seeing that they're fairly evenly distributed? I think it was partly covered in the stat where a lot of the increase in giving was given to like 150 charities, but are there certain subsectors of charities or top areas, maybe the top 3 areas where people give?
That's a great question. We likely have that data. That's something I'll have to follow up on because I don't have that information available unless Mitch, you may happen to have that.
If we're talking about specific like types of causes, it tends to be, from what we see in the data, healthcare, education, and local regional. I don't know if that's the predominant causes that make up those 150. But if we're looking at general trends, those would be the top 3 I would assume they would fall into.
Yeah, and that's a great point actually, because where most of the charities were academic institutions, universities, hospital foundations.
Yeah.
So yeah, health education. Yes, thank you for flagging that, Mitch. So it was typically between health education, local and regional. Those were likely the top 3. But I will follow up on that to confirm.
Perfect, thank you. I think this is in regards to the slide where it showed that donors with incomes 60,000 or less were decreasing. Someone asked, is it possible that donors with incomes 60,000 or less are just not claiming on their taxes, so they're not visible through that CRA data, especially since some people might be inclined to be giving through personalized platforms such as GoFundMe? It seems that the CRA data might not be reflective of the way that particularly younger Canadians are participating in generosity.
Absolutely, yes. And I think I probably glossed over that at the beginning. CRA tax filer data is definitely not all encompassing to highlight the various ways that Canadians, people who call Canada home, are generous. There's so many ways that people are generous. And we absolutely know that not everybody is using or claiming the receipts on their income tax returns. In fact, we also know not everyone files an income tax return. And so there's definitely a gap there, but very valid point. Things like crowdfunding, mutual aid, gifts of physical goods that folks will donate, none of that's encompassed here. So it really, really would benefit the whole sector if we can come up with a different way to define and measure generosity, because tax filer data certainly doesn't cut the whole thing. Anything you wanted to add, Mitch?
Yeah, and the only thing I wanted to add to that was, as you mentioned, Julie, there's lots of ways to determine what generosity is, and it also won't capture, some new Canadians might be giving money back home, and that's another form of generosity, and that won't be captured either. That was the only piece I wanted to really add. But you're correct that in those ranges where we're seeing a bit of a decrease, it may be due to some of those reasons that aren't captured.
Awesome. Also related to income groups, because of inflation, are you looking at maybe adjusting the settings of the income groups?
Well, the income groups is actually the way the CRA defines it. So I'm not sure if that's something that CanadaHelps or Environics necessarily defined. Mitch, can you speak to that?
Yeah, so we haven't we haven't looked at that specifically for this, but we do have data that actually we kind of think of it as current year and constant year income. So looking at, adjusting for inflation versus not. So if we're looking at constant year, for example, basically looks at 10 years prior and seeing what the income levels have actually changed. So of those personas that we looked at, we could see how that income has actually changed in that sort of 10-year ago dollar. So you might see some of that pop out more if you looked at it from that perspective. But that wasn't necessarily part of some of the information we provided here, but it is in the back end.
Do you have any thoughts on how we can learn about donations that are given to individuals over organizations like GoFundMe, or any data on like planned giving stats? Any thoughts on how we could track that?
Yeah, very good question. With GoFundMe, so interestingly, they do report on overall donations that they process on their platform annually. And I know that if an individual does set up a campaign that is for a charitable cause, and in other words, donations would get receipted, that you are able to download those reports. But the information, the data from GoFundMe is very hard to come by, and not just them, but other crowdfunding platforms like Fundraiser, et cetera, which is Canadian. So yeah, that's a tricky one, I think. And with respect to planned giving, that's even more a little bit of a black hole, because I think with anyone on this call who has to manage a legacy program or a planned giving program, that your expectancies are not always cut and dried, and sometimes you're not even aware that a planned gift is on the way until you're notified by a legal firm about an estate and that a gift was left for a charity, which is a great moment for the charity, but it doesn't really help with planning and budgeting. And so I think working with some platforms such as Willfora, and having more of a strategy around planned giving can enable you as a charity to get a bit more insight there. But it really is it's complicated, and having been in that position in a previous life, I can understand why you would ask that question, because it's challenging to get some of that data around typical planned giving amounts. That it's very hard to come by. CRA tax filer data is just one big pool, and they don't differentiate either, which is not helpful.
Yeah, and the only thing I want to add to that, I can't really speak to GoFundMe, and obviously that data is hard to come by. But on that sort of planned giving or any sort of legacy giving, I did a webinar on this a couple months ago, but just kind of speaking to the wealth transfer that's happening in Canada. And it is hard to measure, but we were able to collect some data that tells us who is likely to receive that wealth transfer in the coming year. So coming up with some of those plans, and if we looked at some of those different personas, we could say that, we could tell who is likely to be receiving wealth transfer. And then we start getting into their preferences to say, but are their giving preferences different from their parents? So that is current. We're noticing that that's happening right now. People are thinking the wealth transfer is coming in the next decade, but it's happening now. It's going to continue to happen. And because a lot of that wealth is pooled in that 65 plus age, it's going to continue to happen. But we're seeing a lot of millennials, if we look at generational differences as well, where that have already that high accumulation of wealth and are only going to see that increase as that wealth transfer occurs.
I think that's a nice segue into some of the questions received on demographics. Okay. when you were covering the demographics, those 3 segments were declining. Are there any segments that you see that are growing?
In terms of the revenue, I don't believe so. So I'm sorry, not in terms of change of percent of donors, all of them have increased in the past or decreased in the past year, which is quite interesting. You know, we're seeing francophones is the largest decrease with 11.8%. A lot of them are hovering around 2 to 3%. But if we're looking at revenue, all have increased except for one group. And if we're looking at change in total number of donations or percent of total number of donations, sorry, most of them are also increasing except for that francophone group. So across all groups, we're seeing that decline in donors, but increase in donations and revenue across all age as well.
Great. Are there any particular months of the year when charity donations are highest? And I think this is the same person, so I'll just group this together. Is launching a specific donation campaign in opposed to a general year-round donation campaign more effective?
So I would say December at CanadaHelps and other charities that I've worked with is definitely the highest revenue generating month by far. I think that it, for a number of reasons. First of all, December 31st is typically the deadline for charitable donations for the taxation year. I know 2025 was an anomaly, but it's typically December 31st, which spurs on, those who do want to make some gifts to, support charities, reduce their taxable income. They will do that. December is also typically a very busy month for charities with their year-end plans, their year-end giving campaigns, and Giving Tuesday. So, which does fall in December again this year. And then Cindy, what was the second part of that question? Can you repeat that?
They're launching a specific campaign, I think like a specific timed campaign or a general year-round, always-on campaign would be more effective, or any advice on that?
Right, yeah. Well, of course, I mean, at CanadaHelps, we would definitely recommend that you always have the ability for someone to support your organization. If you do have a website, of course, have that donation prominently on the website and always have the ability to take donations all year round in an always-on format. But definitely there are times of the year, and it would depend on the organization and how they operate. If they have, for example, in-person events that happen and you want to have campaigns that are driving towards promoting the events, or specific fundraising drives. If it's an educational institution, for example, a lot of these institutions are now holding giving days or giving weeks where they, really try to drive. It's like the old days of doing a telethon. They try to drive donations on one particular day, and they're hugely successful, especially some of the universities. They're raising millions of dollars in one day. But to apply that to all charities, I would say it really depends. Like, you probably want to have both. But not be overwhelming, because, when it comes to donors, I think we all know it costs less to retain an existing donor than acquire a new one. We always want to acquire new donors, but in the grand scheme of things, stewarding your existing donors, really making them feel that their dollars are making an impact towards achieving your mission is so important. And so, targeting them with really relevant opportunities to support you throughout the year is always a great idea.
Yeah, and I think that's a great last point there, where it's, making sure you're speaking to your donors, current and potential ones, but understanding how they want to be spoken to and making sure you're aligning with some of their values. And looking from a purely number perspective, December has the highest revenue, and we analyzed that data year over year by month, looking at CanadaHelps data, and it was really interesting to see, of course, the jump in 2020 because of COVID, the kind of decrease, but actually the jump from 2023 to 2024 was quite large in December. We're back above where we were sort of in 2020. So still, prepping well in advance for those end of year campaigns is going to definitely help make sure you're ready for that last month of the year.
Awesome. We're at 3. Do you want to take one last question?
Sure. I'll take one last question and also just say if there are more questions, happy to follow up with all the individuals separately. So, but yeah, go for it, Cindy.
Okay. What is your best understanding of why, as you mentioned during the cost focus trends, people are not putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak? Do they not trust or understand the position of nonprofits, or is there any gap that could be addressed to remedy this?
Yeah, great question. I would say it's a number of things, and that would be like a whole other webinar, I think, understanding the psychology of donors. What we highlighted in last year's giving report was that trust is definitely an issue, and a sense of disconnectedness and a lack of social connection also impacts charitable giving. And so this, coupled with the fact that a lot of external data shows that trust overall is declining in institutions overall, not just charities. Charities still remains a trusted category when it comes to institutions, but it's above things like corporations and government and that type of thing. But yeah, I think that requires like a deeper dive, and we're always doing research. I'm sure Environics Analytics is too, on the psychology of charitable giving and what motivates people to give or not give. So I think that's a continuing thing that we're definitely investigating.
Yeah, absolutely. And we did some research on this question recently, actually, and trust was a big one. Like you said, Julie, like just trusting that where their dollars are going to. But another big one that popped up was just not understanding either what the organization is doing to support the cause or understand the impacts. So I think there's a little bit of an education piece as well that we're seeing that some donors feel like they're lacking. They don't fully understand what is actually being done. So I think there is the opportunity to build that trust, but potentially through that education as well.
Yeah, and communicating impact. I mean, there's specifically with environmental charities, there seems to be a lot of skepticism around what is actually accomplished. Like if I give you $25, where will that go? Like you really need to work on articulating and quantifying where the money will go, even if it's something as simplistic as creating like a symbolic giving catalog. Like $25 will allow us to I don't know, provide like a water purification kit so that an Indigenous community can have access to clean drinking water, like, something like that. And I realize that's a really simple example, but you have to be able to communicate impact.
Absolutely.
Great answer. Thank you so much to Julie and Mitchell for the content. A lot of comments saying that it was very helpful and interesting data that was shared. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to answer all the questions that were coming in, but do know that we will be sending the recording and the slide deck and contact details, etc. And we'll be reaching out and answering any questions that we didn't get to answer on the webinar today. Thanks again for joining. Thanks, Julie, Mitchell, and we'll catch you on the next webinar.
Thank you so much.